Okay, so now we're ready to mount our lower model to our upper model. And what you see here is a centric index that simulates the centric relation. And to make sure that nothing moves around while I'm mounting, I've sealed the index to the maxillary model as well as the mandibular model. Okay? So obviously, in order for this to fit, I had to remove the occlusal index that you see here that simulates the face bow transfer, which we will talk about a little bit later on. So I removed that and I placed on the lower mounting ring. One thing that I need to point out, and it's very important, as you can see here, this part of the articulator is very clean. Okay, it's shiny. It's a polished. It's a machine polished surface, which means you need to keep it clean all the time. You cannot have stone debris in here or wax debris in here at all, because when you try to fit on your mounting ring, it won't have a nice positive fit. And then you end up having a wobble or a play with your mounting ring, which is not good. If you do, it will create a bite error. So it's very important that this part of the articulator, top and bottom as well, they're kept very clean. Now, I wouldn't suggest you guys mounting the lower model in this fashion. I'm holding everything together because everything could fall off. There's a lot of weight here. But if you notice on the top of the articulator, we have these two flat surfaces here, as well as the screw for the incisal pin, and that is conveniently designed so this is held upside down like that. So it gives you a nice flat position without having all that weight turning over. So when you're mounting your lower model, you're actually going to be mounting it upside down, like so. So now if you look at the space now between the model and the mounting ring, it's considerably more than here. So take that into consideration when you're measuring out your stone, or your plaster and water. Okay, so we're ready to go. Everything again is nice and tight. The centric latches are firmly put together and there's no movement on my articulator. If there is, and you don't notice it, you're going to create a mounting error, which is going to turn into a bite error, and then eventually could end up making a remake, end up having a remake. So be careful. This is a very important part of the process, like everything else, although it's not very difficult to do, but you can't take it for granted because it's not difficult, because it's just as important as everything else. So I'm going to mix some plaster and water. Good 20-30 seconds. Over the vibrator, spatulate the plaster to get a nice strong mix. Now you can come over here. I'll open that up. Take a little bit of plaster and introduce it inside the mounting ring, inside those undercuts. So make sure that it's pressed all the way through. You can see some of the excess that's coming back out, which is a good sign. This is a little more challenging now with these external keyways. This is why I personally don't like them. So you have to make sure that you fill them in completely. Because if you don't, it defeats the whole purpose of creating a keyway. So the plaster all the way to the edge of the model. And again, you have to make sure that those keyways are filled in completely with plaster and you don't have any voids in there. introduce a lot more plaster here, so you can see that I'm picking up a whole bunch, and I'm using my finger to kind of displace it here. And I want to make sure that the plaster overlaps a little bit on the edge of the model. And I'm going to go back and clean this up a little bit. Be careful here that you don't scrape too much over the keyways. So these are a little more sensitive to make. Right here, you can see the little void there. I want to feather my plaster coming all the way down to fill that keyway sufficiently, if not, maybe a little bit more. I've overloaded the keyway somewhat. Let's see the other side, how it looks like. That looks okay. And there's a little void back here. Can you see it here? Right back here. I want to make sure that I press my plaster all the way down. Now, knowingly that these keyways take a little longer to make, I purposely mixed my plaster a little thinner this time, not as thick as I did for the top. So now that it's starting to set, I can apply a little more here without having the risk of the plaster falling all over the place. That's pretty good. Now let's see how this is going to match with this, if I have enough. So right about there, you can see how open I am with my pin. Right here, quite a bit. Not sure if I have enough, but let's see how it goes. So you can see here clearly I don't have enough. So while I still have time, take some plaster from my mixing bowl and build all that up. If you've noticed, my articulator has not left the bench yet. It's still on the bench. I haven't lifted it off the bench because I'm still applying plaster. Let's see how this looks back here. Try not to get in the way of the camera. So a lot of times, you know, you're adding plaster. You might want to add plaster here and you want to clean off your spatula. You know, you can just do that. And do that, or against the bench here to keep yourself a nice clean spatula. I think now I have enough plaster on there that I can carve away and start shaping it. Back here, I want to make sure that I press it all the way down to avoid having any voids. And I think we're ready to carve, just like we did for the top one. So I'm going to start here, trying to find the sides of the model too. But be careful now when you get around to the keyway that you don't overcarve the keyway short. You want to leave it a little bit thicker, if anything. And you can always carve it back with a knife after everything is set. But at least the flat portions of the model and the mounting, you can use your spatula to carve it into shape. So we talked about regular stone having an initial setting time of 6 to 8 minutes. You can clearly see the plaster now is a lot shorter than that. It's closer to like 3-4 minutes. So around the 3-4 minute mark after you applied your plaster, it's safe to start picking up the articulator and start carving the plaster to shape. Make sure here on the keyways that you don't overcarve it with your spatula now. Give enough substance here so you can carve it back and sand it back. So notice that I worked on the back side of the model first because that's a little bit harder to get to once the plaster has set. And you can clearly see that keyway has been filled in completely, as well as this one here. And moving to the front. I'm going to use the sides of my spatula. What's always a good idea too is to have a carving knife here too, like a plaster knife, or your 7A or your 6A, so you can carve it. Although I've gotten used to carving it with my spatula over time, so I don't really use it. But in case you run out of time and you want something sharper, you can certainly use your plaster knife. So make sure, again, every time I'm moving my articulator, I'm always holding it together because the plaster is still weak. It hasn't set yet. So I'm not going to rely on the initial setting of the plaster to hold everything together. Things could fall apart and become very weak, and then you have to do it all over again. Or if you don't notice it, you're going to move on with your case and create a big, big error. A mounting error at this point will result into a bite error somewhere down the line, and possibly a remake of the case. So be very careful when you do this. So I'm going to clean off and scrape off as much plaster as I can. I can always go back after and clean it up and carve it with a knife. And now I can certainly feel that the plaster is beyond its initial setting time. Unlike regular dental stone, plaster only requires about 30 minutes to set completely. And it's been about that since the top one. This one is clearly set. And you can see the difference in color. It's slightly a little darker than this. So I'm not going to mess with it too much. That looks good. So we're going to leave that there. So again, my pin is at 0. The pin is touching. Everything is nice and secure. Everything is locked into place. So we're going to leave that for about 15-20 minutes, at which point we are going to soak the models a little bit so we can submerge this into just a bucket of water, so we can soak the models so we don't end up breaking the models and shock them with hot water. Okay? And then we'll take it out of the water, boil everything off, clean off our articulator, and then we can move on to the next point, next step.